A very good evening to you. Welcome to another Newsmaker Live broadcast right here on DBS Television. My name is Timothy Pauling. We'll be together until 10 o'clock this evening, at which time we'll be concluding with the clip that peaked. There's been a very interesting few hours in the Caribbean, and in particular, the likes of Barbuda as well as Anguilla. And for a while yesterday, Antigua and Barbuda seemed to be in the path of Hurricane Irma. That island was spared, but unfortunately, its sister territory, Barbuda, has gone through some bad experiences with regard to Irma, and those cannot be quantified to date, I'm told, because of a lack of communication with that territory. The Organization of Eastern Caribbean States right now is in the throes of trying to coordinate some kind of effective response and also to determine exactly what has happened in some of the territories, including Anguilla, a member of the BVI nations. My guest this evening is the Director General of the OECS, St. Lucian, Dr. Didicus Jules. Welcome to Newsmaker Live, sir.
Thank you.
What is the latest regarding the impact of Irma on some of the OECS territories?
Okay, let me just start with a slight correction. The role of the OECS is not to coordinate disaster. We are playing this role because of the unprecedented nature of this disaster. And we are working very closely and seamlessly with CEDIMA, which is the CARICOM agency that is specialized. So all of them disaster mechanisms, right down to the NEMOs and so on, are part of that infrastructure. The reason we got involved as the OECS is because we've never had a Category 5, and I'm sure you'd have seen the devastation that Grenada experienced when there was that hurricane there. Ivan. Yeah, I mean, I lived in Grenada for 5 years, and I was totally astounded 2 days after going into Grenada, the devastation and the extent of the nudity of the place from the hurricane. So all of the expectation centered around worst case scenarios, that this could be like a nuclear bomb dropped on these islands. And therefore we felt that even as well oiled as CEDIMA may be, there needed to be a strong mechanism alongside supplementing the work of CEDIMA. And that's why the heads of government of the OECS have been very closely in touch. Prime Minister Chastanet, as you know, is the current chairman. So he immediately got in touch with all of the heads. They've been very active. I showed you we have a WhatsApp group for the heads. And people have been calling each other, speaking 3-4 times a day, looking at what needs to be done, the preparations, and all of that is alongside what's the normal protocols for CEDIMA. And our committee, in fact, is an extension. We participate in the CEDIMA meetings daily.
And so far, what is the latest with
the
regard
latest
to the
is
toll
that,
on those
well,
islands?
first of all, we have to be very thankful to God that it has not, the worst case scenarios have not panned out as we anticipated, because everybody in the path of this thing it was anticipated would have been, in a state of total disaster. However, Antigua has been spared, Montserrat has been spared largely. St. Kitts has had some hits, but more collateral damage, and right now their major challenge is electricity and restoration of basic services. But the real devastation now has happened in Barbuda, which is a very flat island just off Antigua. Barbuda is totally devastated. Prime Minister Brown, we spent the entire day just trying to organize for him to get a helicopter to bring him in, because the airport was inoperable. There was absolutely no communication because the single tower fell. He finally got in and reported tonight that 90% of their housing stock has been totally devastated. In fact, given the fact that Jose is on the heels of Irma, if it is projected that Jose is going to come anywhere near Barbuda, he's announced that the government will effectively have to evacuate all of the inhabitants of Barbuda to Antigua. Thankfully, the airport in Antigua, while Antigua has had some damage, it is more manageable. The airport is still functional and so on. In contrast to St. Martin, where the international airport has been totally destroyed. The French St. Martin, we've been trying to get in touch with them. Well, we've been trying to be in touch with both French and Dutch St. Martin. because as you probably know, they were both applicants to be part of the OECS. But we've tried to reach out to them as well. BVI has been very badly hit. Initially, the expectation was that Anegada was where the hit was going to happen, but the hurricane turned slightly, and now Road Town Tortola has been very badly hit. And we've been in touch with Premier Smith, so he is. We're working with him to see, what assistance. Whatever we do, really is going to be in response to what the country's requests and what their priorities are going to be. Now, in preparation for those things, the chairman had put a number of mechanisms in place. So, for example, he asked for that SLASPA dedicate a shed, an entire shed, for disaster support. And the thinking there was right down to a level of fine detail that would make things work more efficiently. So, for example, the packing of, we were going to ask for only essential items. In hurricane relief, people tend to just give, as they say, cautionary sometimes to this thing. What we want to be very clear about the items that are required and ask people to donate only those items. And then in packing those items, rather than stuff a container with everything that comes, you'd have like a 20-foot container dedicated to water, and another 20-foot that would have...
But first, the request would have to come from
the governments. Yeah,
yeah.
But we have a sense of some of the essential things from SEDIMA that normally would be required in such a situation. So we are now going to have to begin to address the requirements and needs of the member states, working closely with SEDIMA and NEMO.
Those are normally seen as major setbacks. In the end, there seems to be no end in sight to our vulnerabilities to those storms. And the information we're getting is that the situation will only be exacerbated with the talk of global warming and the fact that you have low-lying communities, in St. Lucia and the other territories. Yeah. How do we, as a sub-region, coalesce, put our resources together and try to get assistance from the international community to ensure that we put the necessary safeguards in place? I think come tomorrow, literally tomorrow, I'm sure that the international community will be forthcoming in terms of providing the assistance. But as is normally the case, 2 months from now, 6 months from now, they would certainly be cold-hearted.
Yeah, I don't even think I think your projections are overrated, because the frequency and the intensity of these events are such now that there's a fatigue in the support and humanitarian community in dealing with those disasters. And with that fatigue comes a certain insensitivity. People just get tired of, responding to these disasters. So it puts a very serious onus on us to take care of ourselves better. And that is why the Caribbean played such a seminal role in the COP negotiations and continues to play that role in advocacy. In recent discussions with the heads, one of the things that has been decided is that the Caribbean has actually to up its game on the international stage in arguing, notwithstanding the U.S. position on climate change, to ensure that we put everything in place. So one of the things we have done at the OECS, with the support of Antigua, which is the country most advanced, interestingly, in meeting the accreditation requirements for accessing the global climate change funds, we have had workshops for the member states to help prepare so that they can apply and receive the accreditation in order for these funds to begin to flow. Now, these funds will enable us to do a number of things in terms of adaptation, building resilience, and so on. We've had projects through the European Community and USAID that have to do with mitigation measures. So, for example, if you drive through Corinth right now, you'll see a sign by Manny's Bakery, where we're doing some flood mitigation works with the river and the drainage around the Corinth School and the Corinth River. Now, a lot of engineering goes into those works, because this is not your usual road repair or riverside repair. These things have to be done bearing in mind unusual events, and the engineering has to take that into account. In fact, we were very pleased to learn that in the BVI, in the 17 inches of rain that was dumped in as many hours just a couple of weeks ago, we had a project in one of the communities there, and the area where we did the resilience building, the mitigation work, actually held up, and people, what we are actually getting now is from the authorities is the data in terms of the extent of rainfall and the flow of water and so on, the hydraulic studies that will prove that that intervention was as successful as the residents claim it was. So it's clear that we have to, one, engage in a very solid round of what we call climate diplomacy in order to access the resources needed, because to build that level of resilience, it means we have to change a lot of what we've done. How we build things, where we build. We can't just build houses, the era of plywood houses. I mean, if you think of that category 5, and look, Jose is around the corner. There's a third storm triangulated in the Caribbean Sea. I mean, this thing is like a constant flow. And essentially, we're moving into an era where your house is going to have to be almost like a bunker, or at least have a bunker element to it that can safeguard you and your family. Then where we build is going to be important. So spatial
but
planning.
Dr. Jules, we seem to be so lax when it comes to those things, because we've been speaking about them for quite some time now.
Well, we've spoken about them, and yes, that's true. But the thing is, you see, there's never been an incentive. Now nature is, in response to climate change and man's insensitivity to those realities, is actually forcing the issue on us. So we really have no choice. It's a question of survival.
So the cost of housing, therefore, will go up.
It will go up, but you see, I think if we manage this carefully, at the end of the day, we will all be better off. Because think of it this way. You can keep your cost of housing low by continuing to build the way in which you build and in the places in which you build. The OECS just a month ago completed its new building code. If we get that building code passed in all countries and mandated and supported by the necessary legislation, so it makes it mandatory, we can then work with the insurance agencies, for example, too, because the existence of rigid codes like that helps to reduce the risk factor. So it means insurance can be more assured that with those codes, you would have less claim on insurance, and so we can manage the cost of insurance in that way. It means when an event happens, you don't have the extent of devastation that has occurred historically. So your choice is either to continue to do what you've always done and suffer the consequences and have to rebuild your house 3 or 4 times, go into 3 or 4 new mortgages, or build to purpose, as Grenada did after the hurricane. They said their slogan was "Build Back Better," and with the building back better, have the assurance that you can withstand what comes at you.
But under the current circumstances, already people will tell you that they really cannot afford to build a house for, let's say, $70,000 or even $80,000.
Yeah.
And then what is being proposed right now, I'm sure that the cost
Well, the
of
governments
housing will increase.
the governments are conscious of that, particularly in the OECS, and there have been a lot of discussions. For example, when the Chilean president came through, some of the discussions we had was the idea of getting Chile to work with the OECS to support some proposals made by ECLAC on debt for climate change swaps, right? So that some of the national debt could be swapped and allowed to, we put financial mechanisms in place that would help reduce programs that would reduce the cost of construction for people. And through, government, there are many innovative ways in which we can deal with those escalated costs.
But why do you think we're not doing a better job of selling the idea of getting greater assistance from the international community and donor agencies to help us in terms of mitigating the effects of those dangerous storms? And I mean, Irma has been described as a monster. Do you think now those international agencies will take note?
Well, they will take note, but the unfortunate thing is that they will only take, it's how they take note. Like you look at Irma, if you look at the coverage on Irma internationally, a lot of it is focused on a potential hit to Florida. Now, we are just, peripheral to that exercise, especially in the current political environment in the United States. And that's more reason why we need to ensure that we plan and do things that we look out for ourselves. And we broaden
But we do not seem to be
approach.
doing a good job of that, Dr. Jules.
We have not so far, but there have been great efforts, certainly in the last, I'd say the last 3 to 5 years, especially since the last couple of COP meetings, climate change meetings. As I said, the Caribbean has actually played a leading international role in getting the Paris Agreement in place and the subsequent arrangements around that.
What do you think is preventing us from ensuring that our voice is heard? Do you think it's a lack of the necessary human resources?
No, in fact, the Caribbean has an amazing pool of talent to draw on. A lot of, very strong expertise in the 5Cs institution, climate change institution in Belize, within CARICOM, even within the OECS. Here in St. Lucia, we have people who are fantastic negotiators, people like Don Nathaniel. So there is the expertise. The expertise is sometimes stretched, but again, if we work closely together as a region, rather than you can't expect each country to have the full slate of expertise available to stand ground on the international stage. But as a region, we have proven the point that we can do it. And I think the key thing here is for us to find common cause under the Association of Small States globally. So the AOSIS grouping, work with the Pacific, other small states worldwide in order to shape an agenda that we can. And even when we do that, let's face the reality, it's a very brutal, competitive world. So we don't have the clout that some of the bigger countries have.
But why are we called upon ever so often to cooperate with some of those countries on issues relating to, let's say, drug interdiction and terrorism?
Well, it all has to do, every state, and I mean that's a factor of history, every state pursues its self-interest and it uses whatever means are available at its disposal to guarantee that self-interest. So if drug interdiction, if drugs becomes a problem and it is identified that the Caribbean is the soft underbelly of the drugs problem, then we will get assistance for that. We will also be pressured into taking some positions in relation to that.
But is this a case where we cannot fight our own battles? We're going to state our positions in a very efficacious manner, in a very effective manner?
We do, and but the key to that is maintaining unity and solidarity, so that if a position is agreed, that we hold the line on these positions. And to the extent we have done that, we have been successful.
And invariably, very often, we have not been able to do that in terms of sticking together, in terms of foreign policy issues.
I would say not often enough, but there have been significant successes, and the successes are such that increasingly they remind us of what we need to do and how successful we can be when we do it.
What if we're not successful yet again in bringing our issues across to the global community and telling them that we are under siege? And it's coming from some kind of natural phenomenon in that you have those natural disasters occurring ever so often now with great frequency and intensity. How can we state our case in a very effective manner so that the world can listen, can pay attention?
I think a lot of it has to do with the solidity of the case that we prepare. So, for example, we've had a series of meetings within CARICOM and the OECS where we've been discussing. There are a number of issues that appear unrelated, but in fact are all interconnected. So the question of de-risking and debt and all of that, we've been discussing that. And it's clear to us that at the heart of some of our challenges with the aid issue is this graduation formula using GDP that has been applied. And in fact, the OECS was the one who put that on the CARICOM table, that rather than us simply opposing the GDP formula, we should propose an alternative. So we are talking now about, we've put a proposal on the table about vulnerability as an index. And there are some top experts, one of them from the University of Malta, who has agreed to work with us, for us to create an index of vulnerability that is actually composed of a basket of vulnerabilities. So you look at geographic vulnerability, climatic vulnerability, economic vulnerability, and you actually, it is possible to mathematically, including the GDP question, put all of this in a mathematical formula that can be acceptable to make sense to the international community, that very clearly would show the correlation between vulnerability and development progress.
Will that make sense to a president like U.S. President Donald Trump?
Well, I can't speak for Trump. I mean, that's a peculiar situation. But certainly for the world banks and the multilateral community, it would make a lot of sense.
We talk about having economic growth, and I think the chairman of the OECS and Prime Minister of St. Lucia, Mr. Alan Chastanet, is a record as suggesting that at least if we generate economic growth to the tune of 6% on an annual basis, that will be sustainable, that will be on a steady path to long-term economic growth for islands in the sub-region, etc. Considering that we're having those storms occurring, don't you think that's a major setback? And for the foreseeable future, we cannot expect to have any kind of economic growth that we can be proud of?
I wouldn't say that for the foreseeable future we can, because in fact, believe it or not, Antigua, I believe the last figures showed that they were at about a 5% economic growth. So it's really what kind of stimuli we can bring into the economy, what levels of investment, the kinds of economic activity that we can generate. And it requires, I believe, a creative mix. It's not just relying on direct foreign investment. It requires also that we look at building entrepreneurship and innovation within your own population so that people find creative ways. And there's tremendous potential that is untapped. You look at the credit unions in St. Lucia, for example. Sorry, there are huge resources available in the credit union movement that should be used and tapped for development purposes. There's nothing to prevent us from, for example, from injecting new life in the OECS stock market, stock exchange, so that look, for example, at the problems with LIAT. People have been saying LIAT is undercapitalized, we need to inject funds into it and so on. Now, again, the reliance always is, the automatic reflex is government should invest more in LIAT. Well, what about a situation where the credit unions are able to invest, not just in LIAT, but in productive economic activity, buy shares into new ventures and so on in ways that can help to grow the economy?
You're watching Newsmaker Live with my guest is the Director General of the OECS Secretariat. We're focusing on the impact that Irma has taken on some of the islands, including Barbuda and Anguilla, and what lies ahead in terms of the threat that could be posed by Hurricane Jose. We'll continue the discussion in just a moment, and of course, we'll be taking your calls in just a moment. Thank you so much for staying with us. You're watching Newsmaker Live on DBS Television. My name is Timothy Polion, and my guest this evening, Director General of the OECS Secretariat, and he is Dr. Didicus Jules. Later, we'll be taking your calls, so we continue our discussion right now. Normally, we hear, for example, in the Florida Keys of mandatory evacuation. In the Caribbean, you hear of moral suasion, of asking people, you know, not moral suasion, but basically pleading with people to evacuate. I remember several years ago when a storm was approaching St. Lucia, the authorities were pleading with the residents of Ansoray to evacuate, and to no avail. Do you think that we should be making it mandatory in certain circumstances that people should evacuate from certain communities?
Well, I think we are heading to that point because the intensity of these rapid onslaught events are such that if we are going to save lives, this will need to be, some evacuations are going to be, will have to be enforced. Prime Minister Brown, for example, tonight, after he's on return from Barbuda, made it very clear that if Jose follows the footsteps of this Irma, the government of Antigua will have to evacuate everybody from Anguilla, from Barbuda, because he's declared it literally uninhabitable at this point. And it's going to take a lot of effort to rebuild. So you can't have people sort of eking out an existence under these circumstances.
Bermuda would be, the population would be at just about maybe 1,700 or thereabout.
About that, it's
Um,
1,800.
What if there are instances where, for example, the other islands, St. Lucia and the other islands would have to take in some of the residents? How feasible do you think that would be?
The heads have discussed that, and there's been some discussion by the chairman on that. And there's a general, I've never seen the sense of solidarity among OECS heads as deep as it is in this facing this current crisis. I think people understand that we really have no choice but to work closely together, and today it could be you, tomorrow it could be me. So, and besides, the revised Treaty of Bastes talks about the OECS as a single economic and domestic space. These challenges bring home to us the importance of that concept and the need to ensure that we make it a reality. So if there is a need to move persons around, we looked at the possibility of evacuation, what may be required had the storm taken a worst case scenario, and there would have had to be movement of people across the region, evacuation of tourists to certain points. The chairman already had discussion. I mean, a great deal of planning scenario, worst case scenario planning had gone into this situation. There were discussions with the Prime Minister of Barbados, the possibility of, because remember the storm was going north, the north was being affected, so any solution had to be from Dominica, Martinique downwards. We had to look southward, and the best connections therefore would be Barbados and St. Lucia for international transfer of people, evacuation of people, and discussions had already taken place on that front.
How do you deal with those issues when, to a large extent, there's very unique situations? Talking about a storm of 185 miles per hour, we've never experienced this before. So therefore, what are the checking points? What do you gauge? What do you have, for example, as something to compare in terms of pulling all your resources together in anticipation of something that you've never experienced before?
I don't think there's anything you can compare it to, because if you never experience it, it's not totally within the scope of your comprehension. However, there have been Category 5 storms elsewhere in the world, and we will need to learn the lessons of that. Some of the discussions we've been having in light of this current experience is what are the lessons we need to bring forward, and looking at ways in which we can ensure that those lessons are taken on board in future planning.
They include?
One of them is developing a stronger nexus of partnerships around the disaster thing and bringing it down to a community level. Because right now, if you think of it, disaster management has to start, can't just operate at a top level. It has to go down right to the community level and be solid at the community level so that neighbors are looking out for neighbors. The warning systems are effective on the ground. The mobilization and logistics is strong on the ground so that people can be moved if you need to evacuate a community, say ancillary from a low-lying coastal area to further inland. That the community itself can play a critical role in its own evacuation, and at every level you have that degree of organization.
What do you think has prevented people in the islands? Because I do not want to limit the whole discussion to St. Lucia, because you as Director General of the OECS would have a broader view of the whole issue. But why do you think that people in the islands are not so cognizant or seized of the effects of those hurricanes? Although you have had various instances of those incidents occurring, but in a general sense, we don't seem to appreciate the fact that we need to put the various preparatory measures in place. We need to ensure that we have, for example, insurance for our homes. We need to have sufficient food supplies for at least 5 days instead of having sufficient supplies for 1 day, and as soon as it runs out, then blame the authorities?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not. This is not a unique Caribbean problem. It's a global. It's a human problem. People have short memories, and we tend to revert to the habits that we have had. The key to that is very strong public education. So, for example, in a place like Cuba, you've had very strong. You have regular drills for different types, for different scenarios and different forms of disaster. And it's ingrained in the population, so people know what to expect. They know what to do, how to react in certain situations. The protocols are very clearly established, and that's what we need to do. But it's going to take a lot because, as I said, a key thing there is ensuring that at every level we have that degree of organization and we have those protocols in place. The public sensitization and education, reminding people of the consequences, especially historically, like the experience of Grenada when the storm, the major hurricane there, the experience now of Irma in those countries that have been devastated by it. All of these things need to become constant reminders of what needs
But
to
do you
be
need a
done.
mix of, for example...
And within within the schools, for example, these drills need to be, built in so that students themselves, it's part of what education in the Caribbean should be.
But I think it is taking a little bit too long, considering the different territories would have had their own experiences. And in an enlightened environment where we are aware of what is happening in the other territories by now, we should have certainly been more educated and accepting of the need to prepare.
Yeah, that is true. That's true.
So do you need a mix of public education, you think, and enacting the proper legislation?
As I said, it requires an integrated set of interventions. That's public education, certain mandatory requirements. It requires public as well as private sector partnerships. So, for example, if we change in the building codes, we need to have conversations with the insurance industry and get them on board in that process, and find creative ways of ensuring that in putting stronger building codes in place, that the insurance companies now, rather because your building is going to be more expensive, because the risk is going to be is expected to be significantly reduced as a result of the better building practice, that in fact your insurance premium can go down rather than up. Now, work also with the banks to ensure that, given what is happening here with stronger buildings, that the cost of doing those buildings, or the cost of a mortgage rather, does not become excessive on the part of the homeowner. Then what is the role of institutions like the credit unions in terms of ensuring that everyone can afford a home? What is the kind of tax regime and incentives that governments can put in place around the elements of the construction industry that can help further reduce the costs of these things? So it's doable, but it requires a lot of strategic thinking and a lot of design thinking, where we look at all of the components and ensure that overall we make it easier for those things to happen rather than more difficult.
How confident are you that, considering the fact that we tend to be so lax in terms of coming up with the necessary plans and implementing them, that this time around, especially at the level of OECS heads, that they will come up with the various recommendations and ensure that they are implemented?
Well, part of our job at the Commission is, in fact, to put those things on the table to the heads. And as I said, there are a number of things that we are doing right now. The codes are ready. We're doing work on spatial planning, so that we have to be a determination of which areas and what you're allowed to do in what areas. And again, that has implications for national planning, because, for example, you wouldn't want to build, let's, for argument's sake, say a new city or a village in an area that's a valley watercourse, and that has historically been a watercourse, because it means once there's flooding, you're going to suffer the consequences of that. So people like Lennox Honeychurch in Dominica, for example, have done a lot because of their historical knowledge, and especially his knowledge of archaeology and so on, has done a lot of work in looking at the historical geographic features and how these should impact on planning in our countries.
So in the small territories, we know how politics certainly plays a role in determining what course of action you take for the betterment of the entire nation.
Yeah.
So, for example, you say you have a building code, do not construct homes in this particular area, and a politician would send a letter to the Development Control Authority in whichever territory and actually mandate the personnel there to allow that person who is a constituent to build right there. We know that that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for people to say those things, but I don't.
No, but-
I don't subscribe.
But the
to
reality, you don't, I mean, the reality is
it's
those
okay,
things happen.
These things happen, but I'll tell you, they happen because we are not serious enough about the systems that we put in place. And if systems are put in place, especially in the context after experiences like what we have in now, because these are life or death matters. If systems are put in place with consequences for breaching those systems, then we're not going to have that type of that is going to be more difficult, let's put it this way, for that type of behavior to continue.
But Dr. Jones, we're not in Singapore, where you put regulations in place and they are enforced.
Yeah,
That might be stretching it a bit.
Yeah, but Tim, Singapore didn't become Singapore overnight. You know, in fact, if you read the history of Singapore, Singapore was almost an ungovernable backwater when Lee Kuan Yew got into power. But again, what he did was some degree of firm government, but also importantly, a lot of public education and getting people to understand that the future, the survival of the country requires that we go in that direction. And I think there have been sufficient, more and more we get in wake-up calls in this region, especially around climate issues, that should tell us that we have no choice but to take into account some of those realities. And we have to adjust our behavior and our patterns of development accordingly.
Issues relating to climate change, do you think right now it will really gain the kind of attention and respect it deserves in those small island states? Because to talk about climate change is to say something, to focus on something that seemingly is very boring and
No,
something
it's
that
not.
is not,
It's not.
to the average man in
No,
the street.
it's not. Because in fact, I remember distinctly coming into the COP21, one of the things we had done was to, and by the way, for the upcoming COP, we're going to be doing citizenship journalism, where we're asking the person in the street, in the rural areas and the urban areas, to actually produce their own YouTube videos on how climate change is affecting them and their own ideas on what needs to be done to correct those things. Now, these things are important as part of public education. Consists of two things, in my view. One, educating the public about the science and the objective reality of the situation, but it also involves giving expression to public views and understandings of these things, popular perceptions. And in some cases, these popular perceptions may be incorrect, but the ventilation of these perspectives gives you an opportunity to engage the scientific with the popular perception and to have the kind of dialogue between the two, the dispute between the two, that can lead to a better understanding of the reality. And that's why it's going to be so important. You talk to, I mean, climate change, we can discuss climate change in a very academic way, or we can discuss climate change from the perspective of the person in the street. Somebody who lives by the river in Ancillary, with the many floods that have happened there in the past, can speak to you eloquently about the dangers of climate change. They've lived it, they know it, they felt it. Who feels it knows it. Now, right there, again, using the climate change the Ancillary example, OECS had a project that was funded through the New Zealand government. There's a small grants fund that we were administering in the OECS that had to do with the strengthening of the riverbanks in Ancillary. And that has had a big impact in helping to stabilize the situation there. Now, these are just mitigation measures, and yet the successes are clear. So there's enough there evidentially to show people that if we take a different approach, we can handle those situations successfully.
Those people, for example, in Ancillary you made reference to, would have certainly would be very much au fait with matters related to climate change. What if, for example, we were to say that they should be relocated? Don't you think that certainly would change everything at all as far as their perspective is concerned? Because
Well, there might be people who would object to being relocated. I mean, we see that in the U.S. as well. People were asked to evacuate and they stayed at their homes, and then people had to put their lives at risk to rescue them. Again, the key thing is how you explain to people and how they are made to understand the gravity of the situation. And also, what are the alternatives that you are presenting to those persons?
you think that's something we should be considering in those islands, in low-lying communities?
I don't know if it's as simple. I don't know if it's as simple as that. I think we have to look at the historical scientific record. So there are coastal communities that really cannot be considered necessarily to be at immediate risk. So you have to determine what is the nature of the risk that they face. Is it sea level rise? Is it flooding from rivers flooding through the village? It's the nature of the risk that is faced, and then what then is the best solution to follow.
In the aftermath of Irma and the threat being posed by Jose, what impact do you envisage that this will have on the sub-region's tourism industry?
That is something that was the subject of a lot of discussion in the meetings with the chairman, because, again, the way this storm hit, while efforts had been made with some of the hotels and the airlines and so on to evacuate tourists, there were substantial numbers of tourists who remain in the different islands. And in fact, in the discussions on how we go forward for the future, Chairman Chasney has suggested that St. Lucia is going to do something interesting. It's going to put passport readers at the hotels, so that, you see, when a visitor comes in, you can actually know where they stay in. Now, part of the challenge is introducing technologies that would make it easier and more comfortable for these things to happen, because, I mean, I think everybody is fed up with filling out those immigration cards. And we're supposed to get involved with the advanced passenger information system. If you go to the US now, you don't have to fill out those forms. So we can use the technology in ways that enables us to know at any given point in time exactly how many tourists there are on the island, where they're located, which hotels. Again, hotels should be required to work with NEMO, have part of a mandatory evacuation plan. There should be disaster plans for the hotels in terms of protocols, how to deal with certain forms of disaster, and how you treat your guests. Now, these are the things that will give confidence in the sector that it's safe to vacation in St. Lucia, because if you go, you don't have and a disaster strikes, you're going to be reasonably well taken care of.
What about the impression has been given that if one island or two islands are impacted, then the entire Caribbean is affected? How do you end this kind of labeling?
Well, I think the key thing is how we deal with the disasters. And already, for example, the OECS has a very strong communications unit right now, as you know, and we're very proactive. The technology that we have allows us to actually target our messages. So, for example, just recently we plugged into a global IT network for communications. So we recently got a request from a travel writer from the New York Times about adventure tourism in the Caribbean, and we were able to provide them with information of adventure tourism experiences and opportunities across the Caribbean and the OECS. Now, with that kind of targeting, it is then possible for us to send messages out through those networks. So people who are travel writers, to send a message out, as we are preparing to do as I speak, that Antigua is open for business. Barbuda has been affected, but Antigua there have been some hits, but essentially their tourism operation has not been affected.
In a general sense, do you think that there is need for the OECS in particular to pay greater attention to how it markets itself as a tourism destination, and take into consideration the fact that those islands can be impacted from time to time by storms and hurricanes, and then if one is impacted, then, for example, you could have the visitors from one affected territory vacationing in the other territory that is not impacted. Is that something you're looking at?
That's very possible, especially within the thinking of the revised Treaty of Basté. But again, you see, these are governments cannot do everything, and these are things that require the industry people themselves to think creatively, to establish their alliances. It's easy, for example, with a Sandals because of the multinational character of the hotel chain to move guests. I mean, Sandals actually advertises stay in one play at all, so you can move around the Sandals chain quite easily. Now, ideally, what would be great is if across the tourism sector in the Caribbean, we can have that kind of mobility taking place and arrangements where people are able to share resources, to move guests around for just to vary the experience even. So and it's not just about how big you are. You don't have to be a Sandals to make that happen. So for example, there's nothing preventing small boutique hotels, a hotel in, say, a 40-room hotel in Grenada and a 20-room hotel in St. Lucia, to say, look, we have a twinning arrangement. We can offer a package deal. You come to St. Lucia and Grenada, you split a 2-week holiday between the two countries, and it's one price, it's one deal. And they work their internal arrangements.
You're watching your Newsmaker Live. Once again, my guest this evening is the Director General of the OECS Secretariat, Dr. Didacus Jules. When we come back, your calls. Welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with us. Once again, this is Newsmaker Live on DBS Television. I'll put the telephone number on screen right now so that you can call with your questions and comments for my guest. He is the Director General of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, Dr. Didacus Jules, and his appearance is against the background of the threat posed by Hurricane Irma to a number of islands in the Caribbean, but in the final analysis, it took direct aim at Barbuda, and it spared Antigua and a number of other territories. St. Martin are also continuing to feel the effects. There's a possibility, I think, that Puerto Rico could be impacted as well. So we take your calls right now as the sub-region is continuing to focus on Hurricane Irma. Let's talk a little bit, Doc, about communication, communicating among the islands in the aftermath of any kind of disaster, in this case, a hurricane. It's proving very difficult to contact residents over in Barbuda. How do you deal with that issue?
Well, coincidentally, the day before hurricane struck Barbuda, we've had periodic discussions with Lionel Ellis with the Ham Radio Network. In fact, we facilitated the organization, the club or association, as they call themselves, with giving them access to the commission of the MON to put up some of their antennas and have some of their equipment run. And Lionel is one of those people who's been constantly advocating the importance of those civic networks, especially in disaster periods, for facilitating communication. Now, Barbuda brings that right up front and center as a key priority. So in fact, we've actually asked him to start thinking of working with us to shape a network that would enable a continuation of communication across the OECS in the case of a disaster. Because what happened in Barbuda was that their single communication tower, snapped in two under the hurricane.
Because, for example, the instances where people cannot communicate, more than that, you cannot listen to radio stations and so on. Yeah. And I think there was a talk sometime in the 1990s when Radio Antilles was getting all set to shutter as to whether this OECS should purchase that radio station. Is there a need, you think, for the OECS as a sub-region to have a single media outlet?
No, not necessarily. I think you don't necessarily have to have an aggregation of everything in one entity. In fact, some people argue that there are some forms of decentralized organization that in fact can be more effective. There's nothing preventing radio stations across the OECS to have alliances with each other, partnerships that enable that flow of information and enhancement. Also, the technology is changing rapidly. So now you have, I mean, just recently I got on WhatsApp, somebody sent me a link where there's a map of the world, and you can go to any point, any continent, and select radio stations and actually hear those radio stations on WhatsApp. Now, this is the kind of technology that we need to make use of, so that our forms of technology are not reliant on the traditional copper wires and fiber. In fact, one of the problems too that we experience in this current storm, because of the extent of the sea surge, is that the subsea fibers have been affected to the extent that in some places you have problems with internet access. Now, coincidentally, just recently we've been in discussions with Sir Richard Branson on an initiative called One World Web. This is going to provide internet access through satellites, low orbit satellites all across the globe. So the technology is evolving, and there are ways of doing things more effectively. If you have, for example, satellite access, then whatever happens on the terrestrial sphere in terms of earthquakes or hurricanes or so, it does not impact your communication capability.
Is there anything a better job for us to, in the sub-region, for us to do a better job in terms of communicating, even in the aftermath of a storm, a hurricane, a natural disaster, instead of waiting for several hours to elapse, or maybe in some cases several days, before we can connect with the residents of those affected territories?
Well, that's a function of the technology available to us, because our reliance is on terrestrial-based systems. So if there's a hurricane and all the poles fall, your communication system is out. There's nothing you can do. And that's why I'm saying we need to look at modern technology and ways in which we can utilize those things in order to keep the communication systems going.
Talking about communication, what is happening now with regard
and by the way, this is not just about high-tech forms, because what we're discussing with what we want to discuss with Ellis, for example, in terms of the ham radios, that's been there for a long time. It's not high-tech technology, but it's effective.
But don't you think that, for example, the new form of communication basically has really put it on the back seat? Talking about the ham radio?
Well, it works. It works in a lot of situations of disaster. So if it works, then why not use it? And you have a double insurance. You have new technologies, and you have whatever reliant old technologies that are affordable and available.
How is the OECS Secretariat and even those affected territories are coping with the number or the volume of persons expressing concern and wanting to find out about the relatives in those affected territories? What kind of calls are you getting in that regard?
Well, we've had a couple calls from St. Lucians, for example. I guess because we've been working with Chairman Chasney, we've been privy to those calls. People expressing concern about relatives, especially in the BVI in Tortola. There's one particular family where they've completely lost everything: house, car. I guess they're almost practically homeless.
St. Lucian living in the BVI.
In the BVI, and they're asking for what are the plans for evacuation. So because of these requests, certain approaches have been made to see how we can organize for evacuation, an evacuation plan that is going to involve using Antigua, because the airport is functional there, getting people possibly by sea once we get the clearance from SEDIMA that the sea conditions would allow, to move those people from the BVI to Antigua, and from Antigua then they can travel by air to their various destinations. And that solution, because of the fact that the PM is chairman of the OECS, it won't just be for St. Lucians, it will be for all nationals of the OECS who need to be repatriated.
How soon are you hoping to put this into effect?
Well, approaches have been made, so we are waiting word with the contacts we've made as to their readiness to assist. But we need to do it as soon as possible.
Okay, but what, how many people are you looking at generally? In
We don't have a sense of that as yet. Yeah, this is just based on the fact that about 3 or 4 people have made inquiries, and one person matters, so it's enough to look at what mechanism we need to put in place. And we've alerted the other heads of government about that so that they themselves will be conscious of it and dealing with their own diasporas to spread the message.
The finances, where will the finances come from to deal with that particular issue?
That we're hoping will be done through creative means. I mean, you know, in situations like that, we expect everybody to play their part. So a combination of areas of sources of support. So for example, if we're going to be doing a ferry, whichever ferry company we use, we expect that they will put a significant amount in as philanthropic humanitarian support.
And remember, we take your calls. Once again, my guest this evening is the Director General of the OECS Secretariat, Dr. Didacus Jules. Dr. Jules, do you think there's need to set up some kind of fund? I think I could vaguely remember Prime Minister Alan Shastney making reference to this. I think maybe it was either earlier this year, sometime earlier this year, that he made reference to possibly setting up some kind of fund in the OECS to deal with the effects of natural disasters.
Well, we do have a fund. There's a CARICOM fund. It's the Caribbean Risk Fund. In fact, Anthony Isaac, the former Accountant General, is the head of that. And in fact, they have paid out significant sums of money to the participating countries. He was actually in the meeting.
Hold that point, sir. We have a caller line. Good evening. This is Newsmaker Live. You're on the air.
Yeah, good evening. In case of a disaster, right now the hospital in Beaufort, where are the sheds for,
Are you hearing? I'm not hearing.
for the people in case, the patients, and what are the mobile transistor radios or the CBs? What's in place as government or opposition in power? People say they're ruling. What's in place? I want to know.
Thank you so much. I don't know if that issue has any relevance with regard to what we're discussing.
I didn't hear anything.
But okay, we're having some technical issue. Our guest did not hear the question, but he's making reference in particular to the hospital, the St. Jude Hospital, and saying that it, at its current level, how will it be able to provide assistance to residents of the southern part of the island if we have a disaster impacting St. Lucia on the scale of Hurricane Irma?
Well, I mean, that's a matter for the national authorities to determine. I'm not familiar myself with what stage the rehabilitation or reconstruction of St. Jude's is at. So I've seen in the papers that in terms of the new national hospital that there's a greater degree of readiness. So.
Okay, but we were talking about before we took the call.
Yeah, I was saying that there is a facility. There's an echo. There is a facility that is headed by Anthony Isaac. They've paid over $70 million to at least 10 member states that have suffered from disasters. So it's a working concern, and I think if anything, what will need to happen, there's no need to create a new entity. It probably has to be its capitalization will need to be increased, but it's worked successfully, and we need to make better use of it.
Okay. The toll that, for example, those storms take on agriculture and the other sectors, because very often when a hurricane would impact tourism, I mean, somehow you have the finances, you have the support coming from the public sector, and likewise the private sector would naturally come together because they realize that the kind of contribution that tourism makes directly and indirectly to the society, that they would be impacted. But what about agriculture and manufacturing and so on?
Well, that requires its own set of specialized planning, because in the OECS we have an agricultural plan of action, and in fact in the last year and a half we've had a very interesting experience of building an agri-shipping initiative across the OECS. I'm getting an echo. Yeah, building an agri-shipping initiative. We've seen St. Vincent has been a very strong push factor in that whole experience. So we've had a lot of produce being sold from St. Vincent and Grenada in Trinidad and Tobago. We've had stuff shipped to the U.S. Virgin Islands, to the BVI. And what we decided to do essentially was to use this as a pilot that would open the door.
Sir, we have a call. Good evening. This is Newsmaker Live. You're on the air. Hello.
Yes, good evening.
Hi, good evening. What is your contribution,
I'd
please?
like to tell Mr. I would like to tell Mr. Didicus Jules that the name is not Anthony Isaac. It's Isaac Anthony. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Okay,
It's
thanks so
stand
much for the
corrected.
correction. Okay, but you're saying?
Yeah, I was saying that, so the agri-shipping initiative, when the opportunity came to do this, because we had 2 refrigerated boats, the decision was, let us build the road as we walk it. So the fact that we had that shipping facility in place, the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines started preparing the farmers and so on.
We have a call. Good evening. Go ahead with your contribution, sir.
Hello, yes. Very good program, Didicus. I just wanted to indicate to you, you're talking about the agricultural sector. I just want to indicate to you that while I was at Cardi, we did in fact prepare a paper on the basis of what had occurred. I think it was in hurricane in the 80s, somewhere in the 80s. And there's a paper which I did together with Ronnie Pilgrim and Hamilton, which is available, that indicates what type of crops and the sequencing and planting of crops immediately after a hurricane to be able to get back into production quickly. So I just wanted to indicate, in fact, that there are some historical things that you can probably, if you check with Ronnie Pilgrim and Cardi, he will be able to give you a copy of that paper.
Well, thank you very much. We'll certainly look into this, because I think one of our big problems in the Caribbean is our historical amnesia. Too often, excellent work that has been done gets forgotten, it's laid on shelves and so on. And we face that constantly at the Commission itself, even in terms of historical documents belonging to the Commission itself. In fact, in a recent strategic planning session, one of the things we decided, for the OECS Commission to be effective as a servant and a facilitator of regional integration, we have to deal with knowledge management more effectively. A lot of key institutions are going in that direction. So the World Bank is now more defining itself as a knowledge institution than a bank, a traditional bank. Because what they are finding is with their historical experience and their knowledge of projects worldwide and best practices worldwide, things that have worked to solve different problems, that knowledge itself is even more valuable than the loan portfolio that they traditionally give. And in fact, that knowledge can be leveraged for even greater profitability and success. And that's one of the things we want to do. So identification of best practices in member states. Where we see something happening in a particular member state that is very successful, we share the information with other member states, we make it a model, and see how we can spread that across the entire OECS.
Once again, we continue to take your calls. My guest this evening is Director General of the OECS Secretariat, Dr. Didicus Jules. We have about 15 minutes left on the program as we continue in a general sense to focus on Hurricane Irma, the effects and the toll it has taken on some of the islands, in particular Barbuda. Come this evening and into tomorrow, what will the OECS Commission be doing? Well,
we had initially stood down a bit from the level of alertness and crisis preparation we were in when it appeared that the storm did not have as catastrophic an impact as possible.
We have a call. Good evening. Go ahead with your contribution, caller.
Hello, good evening.
Hi, good evening to you, ma'am.
Very interesting program.
Thank you.
My question to you is this. When I noticed the direction that the hurricane was taking when it was coming over the islands, if that hurricane had come down a little lower, it would mean that a lot more of the OECS countries would have been inhabitable, as they say, for Bermuda. What I want to know is, in the event of probably something like that happening, where more than 2 or 3 of the countries are affected, is there any organization that you all have linked with on the outside, like in North America or Europe, or who would come to our assistance in an event like that?
Thank you so much for calling, ma'am.
Yeah, well, there's a network of international organizations that deal with disasters of different kinds. And SEDIMA would be linked to those organizations. So through SEDIMA, the wider world would be involved. Plus, the diplomatic community is of great importance in this, and that is why one of the meetings that was held yesterday, or was it the day before, so much has happened, either yesterday or the day before, was a meeting between the chairman and all of the diplomatic community in St. Lucia. And the briefing given by Prime Minister Chasney to those diplomats in St. Lucia resident and those accredited to the OECS is to put their governments on a state of high alert and readiness in the event of a catastrophic impact from the hurricane. So that we actually identified, like countries like Mexico, for example, what forms of assistance we could get from them, Ecuador, a lot of Latin American countries. And even now that things have not worked out as disastrously as they could have, there are still things that we need to pursue. For example, the chairman is saying that in the event, because Irma is not over yet, it's heading for Florida. If it hits Florida, let's assume nobody else in the Caribbean gets affected, but it has a disastrous impact on Florida. That is going to drastically affect all of the rest of us because a lot of our trade goes through Florida. Now, again, we need to look at those things in strategic terms because Florida, that whole seaside of the U.S., is frequently visited by storms. We cannot continue to rely on patterns of trade and as a lifeline, a single lifeline going through Florida. So while we continue our trading relations in that way, we need to look south, to look through Panama and these other countries to see how we can have alternative routes of trade and sources of food and other supplies that we can draw on from the south.
Because this this particular storm is life-changing, and in terms of some of the critical decisions that's forced us to take.
Yeah.
So therefore,
but not to cut you short, Tim, but that's why I said earlier that the OECS got as deeply involved in the coordination of this as we have, because it's not your usual storm. And it raises so many fundamental issues above and beyond just the disaster response, right? There are a lot of long-term strategic things that need to be considered and alternatives that need to be put in place. Not necessarily ditching or changing existing patterns like the trade thing, but to broaden and diversify so that all our eggs are not in one basket and we held to ransom by what happens in Florida.
So we cannot always focus or draw negatives from incidents of that
No,
nature.
in fact, I've said all the time that for me personally, every crisis or every problem is an opportunity, and we have to find the opportunity in the crisis.
Now, with regard to how we respond, take for example the destruction to infrastructure and particular. Okay, we have a call. Good evening. This is Newsmaker Live. You're on the air.
Good evening, Tim. Good evening, Dr. Jules.
Good evening, sir.
Dr. Jules, I must say I'm very encouraged to have your involvement and participation at this time, given what's happened and the scope of the impact of Irma. What I'd like to say is, given what may have happened that we seem to have avoided at this time, that the waiting for something which is a near miss for us to be galvanized into action the way we happen to be, quite admirably, I think it shows us that we have the capacity, when we are ready, to actually do what we need to do to make those leaps, take those leaps and have the advances that we need. So I'm just wondering what your view is regarding the impetus, the motivation and the political will, perhaps, that we need to sustain those efforts. What do you see as the way forward?
No, in fact, you're quite
Thank
correct
you so much, sir.
you're quite
Appreciate
correct
your
about that, and that's in line with what I was just explaining earlier before your call came in. That for us, this situation, as potentially catastrophic as it was an opportunity to get involved, help to create a broader matrix of relationships around disaster preparedness. We've had discussions. As I said, we are part of the SEDIMA, working seamlessly with SEDIMA and CARICOM on this. But we have also said to SEDIMA, post this season, we need to sit down and formally look at the arrangements right? The protocols involved, the speed of response, all of these things, to see how we can engage better. Because again, these things are going to be, these events will become more frequent and very likely more catastrophic. Now, we cannot then wait and move from season to season and mobilize every time it happens. So we now have to move to a modality where our response is almost seamless and easy to put in place. And that is going to require a different arrangement of relationships and relationships that go right down, as I said earlier, to the community level, so that there is not that sense of wait and see, or wait and depend on government, or wait and depend on, say, DEMA, or wait and depend on the US or whoever to solve the problem.
Well, I just wanted to make the point about the damage done to infrastructure, particularly schools. Early on, we made reference to the impact normally on tourism and the economy. What about the education system in the aftermath of a storm?
Well,
where,
it's interesting you raise that, Tim, because even before all of this, I had already had some discussions at the level of the OECS Ministers of Education. But we need to come back to that point, right?
You're watching Newsmaker Live. Go ahead with your contribution. Okay, we'll have the call, but go ahead, Doc.
Yeah, at the level of the OECS Ministers of Education, we had exactly that discussion, especially after COP21. And the climate funds that we are hoping to access would enable, part of these funds would be available to build, to strengthen and build resilience in public infrastructure. And one priority area we identified was a complete refurbishing of this education infrastructure, because in all of our islands, schools serve as hurricane centers. Now, so we kind of fulfilling a dual purpose. If we rehabilitate schools, but do it in a way that we strengthen their resilience, we really build them as proper hurricane centers or rehabilitate them as proper shelters, then it means then that we are enhancing the school plan for educational purposes, but also to fulfill community requirements. And simple things, for example, building, putting in water tank systems. I was PS Education when we built the Dame Pullet school. Now, if you notice, Dame Pullet has a water tank that is the same style of size and capacity of tank as some of the hotels have. Mm-hmm. So that school can go for 3-4 months without Wasco water. These are the kinds of things that fund will enable us, give us the opportunity to put in place, so that schools can really be more resilient in terms of serving the community in times of disaster, but also improving the plant facility for educational purposes.
Let's take a final comment from you, sir. Okay. My producer is saying that we have a call. Yeah. Good evening. Newsmaker Live, you're on the air. Thank you so much for holding on.
Yeah, hello?
Hi, good evening to you. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, Tim.
Good evening.
Some time ago, I heard on the radio that some special arrangements were being made for tourists who come to St. Lucia. As long as they check in here, they could go to Grenada and St. Vincent without any further checks. Would that apply to regional tourists or only people from North America or so on?
Thank you so much.
Well, I'm not totally sure.
Hold on, caller.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure what the caller is referring to. I'm not personally familiar with it.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes. Can you repeat your question?
Yes,
No, I heard the question. Yeah,
okay.
I heard the question. I'm saying I'm not personally familiar with the arrangements that the caller is referring to. Oh. What I can tell you, though, is that from the perspective of within the OECS, there's the freedom of movement of people. So any OECS national traveling to any OECS country gets an indefinite stay stamp in their passport, and you can stay for however long. You can go for 2 weeks, 2 years. There's no requirement to produce bank accounts or get work permits or any such thing.
Yes, caller?
Hello, yeah. Mm-hmm. No, what I'm saying is that I understood just for tourists, if a tourist comes in to St. Lucia, he checks in, he doesn't have to check in into Grenada or no customs, nothing to clear. He can just go freely to Grenada or St. Vincent.
Yeah, no, I'm not aware of this. I'll have to check that to find out whether that was put in place. What I can tell you, though, is that I know there are some situations, like in Uanora, prior to in fact, it's still in place. There is a St. Vincent immigration station in Uanora Airport. because of that was prior to their construction of their international airport. So visitors coming, going especially to the Grenadines, would actually clear Vincentian immigration at UNORA, and just when they arrive on with charter flights, right, Vinci Air and so on, Win Air, they would just walk through.
Yeah.
But I'm not aware that there's any wider arrangement than this particular one.
Oh, well, I understood there's one city they could go to St. Vincent, the Grenadines, and Grenada without any checks. I'm saying if so be the case, that should be for everyone, not just for tourists.
Yeah.
So that's my contribution.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing it with us. Final comments from you, Doc?
Yeah, well, the final comment really is to remind listeners that while the worst appears to be over for us, remember we are part of a wider region. Places like the Bahamas are still seriously at risk. Cuba, Haiti. Haiti, unfortunately, has been, a long-suffering sister in the region, the brunt of all hurricanes. So we have to bear that in mind and bear in mind too our responsibility to those sister territories. Turks and Caicos look seriously threatened now. And importantly, we have to also remember that just in almost following the footprints of Irma is Jose, and it seemed to be growing in strength. There's also a third hurricane, the name of which I just saw on the internet tonight, out in the Western Caribbean Sea. So we're actually facing a trio.
I think it's Katia.
Katia, yeah, a trio of hurricanes playing in that space. And from what the scientists are saying, the warmth of the sea at this time is actually inducing greater strength in these hurricanes. So it's not a time for us to relax. While we can breathe a sigh of relief and say a prayer of thankfulness, we need to keep in mind the dangers that other sisters and brothers in the region face and not relax our own vigilance and preparations.
Dr. Jules, thank you so much for being my guest on this evening's Newsmaker Live. As always, thank you so much for watching the broadcast and contributing via your calls. If it's Wednesday, it's Newsmaker Live. Time now for the clip that peaked. Once again, as the broadcasters, a very good evening. My name is Timothy Polion saying good night and goodbye.